Hello, welcome to this discussion on the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis and Europe's impending long winter. My name's Daniel Quiggin. I'm a senior research fellow in the Environment and Society programme here at Chatham House. And for the next hour, I'm going to be your chair. The discussion is going to be on the record and is being recorded for those who aren't able to make it, and it will appear on the Chatham House website in due course. The chat function will be open for members to share observations or comments with the wider group, but please, and I really can't emphasize this enough, please do pose questions for the panelists in the Q&A box such that I can see them and then pose them to our experts. And I may ask you to unmute yourselves and ask your questions directly. We have two fantastic speakers for you today, Michael Bradshaw and Olena Pavlenko. We'll have around 15 to 20 minutes of opening remarks from our distinguished experts, followed by a bit of back and forth between the three of us, and then around 30 minutes of open discussion where we'll try and address as many of your questions as we possibly can. Without further delay, please let me introduce Dr. Olena Pavlenko, who is president and co-founder of the Ukrainian Dixie Group think tank and the Ukrainian energy website. Olena has worked in the energy sector for more than 20 years, covering issues such as energy security, energy transparency, integration of the EU-Ukraine energy markets, and open data in the energy sector. She also served as a non-staff advisor to the Minister of Energy and Minister of Foreign Affairs. She is an author of the brochure Playing a Long Game: How Civil Society Can Lead to Changes, about Ukraine's experience in EITI implementation for civil society organizations in other countries. Without further ado, Olena, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, dear colleagues, for the opportunity to talk today. I will, if you don't mind, I will share with you some slides to be more interesting. And also, I would like to start from one of the questions you mentioned, actually the dependency on single state actors, because I think this is one of the causes of the problem we have now. This is not the secret that Europe was deeply dependent on Russian gas. And despite the fact that actually rules of diversification say that there should be no more than 30% dependency from one source of supply, sometimes dependencies of European Union from Russian gas reached almost 50%. So actually, this is to show you that during quite a lot of time, Europe was really dependent on Russian gas, and sometimes this dependency reached up to 50%. That is why when the process of switching from Russian gas started, it was really so painful, because having so big share on the European market, Russia had the ability to strongly influence the price, and it influenced when it didn't like something what Europe did. For example, when Germany did not want to certify Nord Stream 2 Russian pipeline, actually you can see how it was connected to the prices, and how Russia started to not to actually allow European companies to buy additional volumes of gas or from Russia to fill the gas storages, for example. And Gazprom also did not fill gas storages, which again influenced Russian gas. So, which again influenced what happened on the European market. Again, it was like a hard dependency, and when European Union wanted to move from the Russian gas, it became quite a painful task and influenced the prices on European markets. But I wanted also to say that this strategy Russia already used with Ukraine in 2009 and in 2013. So for us, it's not a new strategy. You can see that in 2001, Russia started to demand from Ukraine gas pipeline to co-own Ukrainian gas pipeline. And when Ukraine refused, there was quite a similar strategy. Russia became the single source of supply, and then it started to increase prices for Ukraine. And then in exchange for agreement on Black Sea fleet And also in exchange of not to sign association agreement, we were offered with $100 discounts. But again, the price was too high for Ukraine. And the very huge lessons learned. What I wanted to say here is that the war which we have now, it is not the cause of the crisis in Europe. And Russia used European and Ukrainian dependency to blackmail us. And the situation could be even more complicated if there, for example, Nord Stream 2 could be built. And Europe could be even more dependent from Russian gas. So in some way, the war which we have now just speeds out the solution of the problem which started way before and which we have now. And the lessons learned also is that we probably should take into account the dependency. It's a threat for the country. It's a threat for the European Union. And even if we do the transition, if we will start developing the critical minerals, and by critical minerals, yes, for the renewables development and other stuff, this also should be taken into account, and which should not fall into dependency of one country. Now coming back to the winter, which we will have soon, the prices of gas has fallen, and thanks God we have in Europe quite enough amount of gas. The storages are filled with 90%, and there are discussions where other possible ways to store gas. And here I think Ukraine also can be helpful. Because, sorry, this is just to show that how the dynamic of prices moved. And why Ukraine could be helpful, because Ukraine does have gas storages, especially on its western borders. And we actually already did this business before the war, and our gas storage operators still propose such possibility to store gas in Ukraine, which also can be helpful for European countries to survive through the winter and also closer to the spring 2023. What else can happen this winter? I think that Russia will still make a pressure on European countries. One more issue, what can happen this winter, is that Russia will try to stop gas transit through Ukraine. It already decreased the amount of gas transit quite significantly. We still have some volume which we transit to Europe, but Ukraine could be the next after the Nord Streams, where as an instrument, as a mechanism to make a pressure on Europe. So that's a question which I was asked quite regularly, and yeah, I think this scenario is possible. I also wanted to say about another not threat but point which can happen is that by cutting gas through Ukraine, Russia can also continue demanding from Europe and especially from Germany to start Nord Stream 2. It is already doing this. I think it will continue doing this. And for Russia, it is important to start launching, especially Nord Stream 2, because if Europe does this, it means that Europe is ready to break its own rules, because Nord Stream 2 is not certified. So I think this is very important for all of us, for European Union, not to allow such scenario. We may not have problems with gas at the beginning of the winter, because again, we all have our gas storages filled, but there might be the issues, especially if there are low temperature by the end, closer to the end of the winter or beginning of the spring. There might be the questions with gas prices and the amount of the gas. But I think another issue is to start thinking how to be ready for the heating season or winter season 2023, the next season, because if we do not use Russian gas starting from the next year or middle of the next year, we have to think about additional sources of supply already now. Maybe a few words about Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of problems now with the energy supply. We have 40% of Ukrainian energy infrastructure damaged. We do have gas reserves and coal reserves as of now, but Russia really badly damaged our infrastructure. So we can get through the winter if there are no strikes and no further damages of the infrastructure. As of now, we have outages of the electricity. Me personally, I live 4 hours with electricity, 4 hours without electricity. We are waiting for when the government, when the companies will restore and will maintain the electricity supply to consumers. And as of now, Ukrainians really need support with the generators, with transformers, with other equipment to help our companies to deal faster with these damages. I would like to finish with 4 lessons learned from this situation where we are. First, I think this gas crisis, this gas wars, they will speed up the development of renewables, the green transition of many countries. Because biogas, biomethane, hydrogen projects, they might be more competitive for the future. But at the same time, again, we should keep in mind that this security benchmark should be present in our strategies. Because Germany was a leader in energy transition, but it had great dependency from Russian gas, and now it pays quite a huge price for this. We also have to reconsider what the energy security is, because if one country can blow up 3 pipelines in the sea and no one is punished for this, I think this is not the kind of security which we want to have. And the last issue is, I think we have to reconsider the role of Russia in nuclear sector, because the case with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is captured, shows that if Rosatom builds its own nuclear power plants in other countries like Africa or Central Asia and others, it can use its nuclear power plants as happened with Ukraine. In Ukraine, it could be a potential nuclear weapon. So I think this is a question for the countries who develop nuclear energy and build nuclear power plants to think how to remove Rosatom from such business. Thank you very much. I will stop here and will be happy to answer all your questions.
Olena, thank you very much. And thank you also for dialing in and giving us your insights, given that you're in Kyiv and suffering from 4 hours of blackouts every day. So really, really appreciate your time. I have some questions for myself, of my own, and some questions have started coming in the Q&A. Please do keep them flowing. We will keep all of those questions though for after Michael has presented. So let me just quickly introduce Michael. Michael Bradshaw is Professor of Global Energy at the Warwick Business School. He gained his PhD at the University of British Columbia and now works at the interface between economic and political geography, business and management, and international relations. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and past vice president and fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Michael's research on the geopolitical economy of the global energy has examined the role of foreign investment in Russia's oil and gas industry, global energy dilemmas, and the interrelationship between energy security, climate change, and economic globalization, and the challenges to the UK's gas security. Again, without further ado, Michael, please, over to you.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the introduction. Now I've got a lot to live up to. So I don't have any slides. I mean, this is a fast-moving area, and trying to keep up with yesterday's news is challenging enough. I mean, there's also a huge amount of information out there, and some of it at times it seems contradictory, and trying to actually sort of get to an understanding of how all this all stacks up, I think is constantly challenging. And I'm relying on the expertise of many others. I guess as an academic, I spend a lot of time reading and listening and trying to synthesize what's going on. And so that's what I want to do. And I want to put the comments we've had so far, I think, have been really useful, both in the sort of historical context of how Europe has got to where it is, and the specific issues around the role of Ukraine and what Ukraine might offer in the future. But I want to talk about what's happening in a global context, but also, in terms of wider issues in relationship to the energy transition, whether or not this current global energy crisis is going to derail the transition or not. And of course, many of you probably listened to the IEA launch its World Energy Outlook last week, where it was a very clear narrative that actually, that far from it, what this crisis is going to do is actually accelerate the transition. Well, I guess that's a question for debate, and maybe that's something we'll pick up in the Q&A as we go forward. I think it's useful to go back at least 12 months and probably more to understand the state of the global gas market in particular. Coming out of the COVID pandemic lockdown, obviously we were suffering at this time last year what we were calling a global price crisis, because demand was surging, and for one reason or another, the supply side was finding it difficult to match, and prices were going up very rapidly. But little did we realize at the time, of course, that Russia was also, in the process of kind of softening up Europe by constraining supplies into Europe, not filling up storage, not engaging in the spot market, as part of perhaps trying to make sure that it was benefiting from very high prices, but it perhaps had other motives in mind that became clearer more recently, of course. So, Dan posed 3 questions, and I want to address them in turn. But I think the key point that comes out of where we were 12 months ago is, even before this, we had a very tight oil and gas market with very little room for maneuver. And those in the industry will know that building LNG plants takes a lot of time. It also takes an awful lot of capital. Once you've declared a final investment decision, 4 to 5 years in most instances to build a plant. Getting to FID itself takes a lot of time. You have to sign up buyers who are going to agree to take your gas to finance the development of the terminal. It's not something you can build up very quickly. And that does mean that, at this moment in time, we know how much more LNG is coming onto the market in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years. And the answer in the next couple of years is not very much. And so we already have a tight market, and we also have a situation where additions to supply are going to be fairly minimal. And we also know that the LNG industry itself, is subject to technical failures. We saw that, we saw the problem with the Freeport LNG plant in the US with the fire. The Gulf of Mexico, it's hurricane season. From time to time, that has caused problems. There are other constraints on the industry, the availability of shipping, and also the terminal capacity to import the LNG. And all of these things are very important to understand, that it's very difficult to suddenly adjust and start finding alternative sources of supply to compensate for the loss of pipeline gas from Russia. So with that in mind, the first question that I was asked was, have European preparations been sufficient to stave off an energy crisis this winter? Well, I guess the simple answer is we'll wait and see. But I want to be optimistic and say, well, actually, Europe has done as much as one might expect, because we've had Repower EU, we've had various challenges to reduce gas demand, we've had 10-point plans and all of this. And so what Europe, and one of the problems I think in this debate is we tend to talk about Europe and states. But this gas industry is companies, not countries. And so it's companies involved in the flow, in the market, in the delivery, and it's the market and price signals that change the flow of gas. So Europe has been successful in finding alternative sources of supply. So, existing pipeline suppliers like Norway and Azerbaijan have increased production. There has been reductions in supply from North Africa, but overall that's a positive. But the most significant thing that's happened, of course, is that they found alternative sources of LNG, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So all of these policies have been successful in attracting LNG, but it's come at a very high price. And we saw the price markers on one of Olena's charts there. Not just for Europe and European customers, but for elsewhere in the world as well. I mean, Europe has essentially exported its own energy insecurities by driving up the LNG price and diverting LNG from other countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh being 2 in point, who now have their own energy crises because they can't secure affordable gas. And that's what we need. We do need to understand that what Europe's, this is why, in a sense, the tragic situation in Ukraine has planetary consequences. both in terms of the impact on availability and access to energy, but also the carbon consequences in terms of emissions. So we've seen this drive to try and reduce demand, and that's been primarily driven over the summer by demand destruction. Industrial demand has fallen quite significantly simply because gas prices are so high that industry has stopped producing. That is not a positive. That has a negative impact on economic output, on employment, and very real questions are being asked now about the ability of high energy intensive industries in Europe to survive the next 2 or 3 years, and what this means longer term for those industries. So it's a real challenge in terms of the dangers of deindustrialization. Of course, we're now focused on households as well, coming into the winter season, where energy poverty is the form of demand destruction. People simply cannot afford to purchase the energy services against the cost of living crisis challenges, summarized by notions like heat or eat. So this is not a positive situation, but it is driving down demand. And the demand seems to have fallen by about 10%. The target is 15%, but it's coming at a social and economic cost, but it's very, very necessary. The other thing to remember, of course, is although we're focused on, the comments are on gas, we actually also have an electricity crisis in Europe at the same time, in part because of the interconnection between gas and electricity. Across the European Union, I think gas is responsible for about 20% of power generation. In the UK, it's about 40%. But there are other problems elsewhere in the power sector. We have problems with the nuclear fleet in France. We have Germany continuing to retire nuclear power generation. And we have problems with hydropower in places like Norway after a very hot and dry summer, and even problems moving coal around because of low water levels in European rivers. Now, so if they're all negatives, there is a positive, and that is we've enjoyed a mild autumn so far. Dan and I were talking about the fact that neither of us have put our central heating on yet because it's been very mild. But unfortunately, the Met Office in the UK says that it looks like a cold winter. I don't know how they know. But clearly that is a key issue, because of the role of gas in heating, European gas demand is so weather dependent. So so the positives, demand is falling, but at a cost. The other positive is storage is full, 90% plus. So I think, as Olena herself said, we're going into the winter in a fairly positive situation, albeit at a very high cost. What happens next? Well, it's weather dependent. It's dependent on the continuing flow of LNG, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And it's also dependent on there not being too many technical outages, which can cause disruption in delivery. So the second question I got asked was, what would Russia's reaction be during the winter, after the winter period, if Europe avoids market failure? If we get through the winter, how would Russia respond? I think we need to sort of look at the scale of the adjustment that's having to happen. In 2021, Russian pipeline exports to Europe stood at about 140 BCM, about 40% of European consumption. Now, I've seen various estimates out there, suggesting that by year end this year, they would have fallen to about 60 BCM, so fallen by more than 50%. And again, Olena's alluded to this. If we look at the 4 pipeline routes into Europe, Nord Stream 1 and 2, Yamal, transit through Ukraine, and Turk Stream. Well, Nord Stream is effectively out of operation. Nord Stream 1, certainly. One of the pipes of Nord Stream 2 is damaged, but I agree with Olena. We should just think that Nord Stream is just not there, and it's not going to be there indefinitely, probably. So Nord Stream's gone. The Yamal pipeline through Belarus and Poland has not been delivering gas for quite a while. So what we're left with is flows through Ukraine, and I agree that they are very vulnerable, and Turk Stream. And Turk Stream may continue because Turk Stream is supplying Southern Europe, including Hungary, that's done a deal with Gazprom. But the problem with the Turk Stream flow is it doesn't move gas elsewhere into Europe and therefore compensate for failures elsewhere. The other factor is that Russian LNG continues to flow into Europe. Russian LNG from Yamal, being delivered by Novatek and its partners, is being delivered everywhere but the UK and Lithuania, who currently have sanctions on it. And that will continue for the foreseeable future. I don't see the European Union sanctioning those flows. More likely is that Russia might decide it's going to go for cold turkey and say, right, no flows. But even that, I think, is unlikely. So what that means is, if we come through the winter, how are we going to fill up for next year, as Olena has said, and where is that LNG going to come from? If we're just left with Turk Stream and Russian LNG, I mean, what are we looking at? 30, 40 BCMs at most, a big gap to fill. And the harsh reality is that there's really not enough LNG in the world to do that. The other thing to factor in is one of the reasons that we've been able to fill the storage in Europe is because Asian and Chinese LNG demand has been down very significantly. So, over 20% reduction in China's LNG demand year on year for a variety of reasons. And that's meant that many of the long-term contracts signed by Chinese companies have actually been delivering gas into Europe and making plenty of money out of it in the process. But what if Asian demand recovers? We could find ourselves next year faced with a double whammy of very low flows of Russian gas from Turk Stream and LNG on the one hand, and an even tighter LNG market as Asian demand recovers against the backdrop of a minimal amount of new LNG production. And that's why people, and I think Olena has also alluded to this, are talking about, even if we get through this year, this time next year, it could be even more problematic. And the bad news is the following year, it's not going to be any easier either, because there's not a lot of new LNG coming into the market. So I do think we need to think about this as being at least a 3-winter crisis. And over that time, we can make significant changes. We can take measures to improve efficiency, reduce demand, and build resilience. So what does Russia need to do? I think the harsh reality is that Russia doesn't need to do anything. If Russia wants to continue to flow gas through Ukraine, and in Ukraine wishes that to continue, then it might happen. But I would expect that the minimum that Russia will do is continue to flow Turk Stream and continue to supply LNG. But more than that, it doesn't need to. It just needs to wait and see what happens this winter and what happens next. What else can it do? I mean, all it can do, I think it's pretty much written off the long-term prospects of a European gas market for Gazprom. And certainly if you look at the IEA's analysis, their working assumption is that Russia is no longer supplying pipeline gas to the European Union and struggles to reorient to Asia. So the last question, I'll be very quick on this because Olena's also alluded to it, is about how will the energy crisis ensure future dependence on single state actors of goods and services don't occur in the future. And I agree entirely with, we mentioned this issue of critical materials. I think at the end of the day, this heightened concern about energy security, securitization, you can already see that it's focused minds on thinking about supply chain diversity. And everyone now, this oft-quoted Churchillian call for diversity. You look at any of the critical materials strategies coming out of the United States, out of the European Union, the UK, Japan, and on and on and on. There you have all these charts showing about, the concentration of production of critical materials in certain countries, the role of China and Chinese companies in processing, the role of Chinese companies in producing low carbon technologies, against a backdrop of growing, continued tension between the United States and China. You look at the intent of the CHIP Act in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, terms like nearshoring, ally shoring, all of these are coming into our vocabulary in terms of wanting to look at building resilient supply chains as close to home as possible around critical materials and high technology required for not just the development of low carbon technologies. These same materials are critical in the defense sector, in EVs and so on and so forth. So I think the question then perhaps is, what about the low carbon transition? Will this be accelerated by this? That's the intent. I think the reality is that there are various barriers, some of which are identified in REPowerEU, issues around planning and permitting, for example, issues around a supply chain, having the capability to construct and install the new infrastructures. Equally, you might be able to install your new wind farm, but if you can't connect it to the grid, it's not much use. All of these things are probably going to mean that there are significant hurdles to be overcome to accelerate the low carbon transition as the solution to the current crisis. And it may also be more costly, because the economists will tell you that, globalization, international trade has delivered lower cost inputs into these industries. Now you put the veneer of global energy, of global geopolitics across it, and you worry about dependence on China, it changes the equation. So I think at the end of the day, the pluses and minuses may result in an acceleration of intent, but we must see whether it will be an acceleration on the ground. But I would say that coming back to where I started, the mention of the WEO and the IEA the other week, it seems to me, I mean, they have talked consistently about an investment gap existing between investment in fossil fuels and investment in low carbon energy. The answer is not to increase investment in fossil fuels. It's to invest in more in efficiency and more in low carbon power generation to provide the answer. But there are those who would rather see the answer as being more fossil fuels. But I think the lesson learned here is, fossil fuel dependencies are not sustainable in any number of ways, not just geopolitically, but clearly environmentally. And I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. That was really fascinating, as always. I'm going to keep my couple of comments and questions fairly short because we have actually had lots of questions come in. I suppose I think this narrative and analysis, I think we're all agreeing on, and I think is that what's been developing in policy circles as well, that it's not really this winter that's the biggest concern, it's next. And there's lots of projections around how much LNG capacity within Europe, import capacity, will expand. I suppose the question that lingers in my mind is, given the upstream investment declines globally, but also within the US, and the pressure that the fracking industry has been under in the US. I was looking at US EIA data just earlier on today to look at the drilled and uncompleted wells. And if people don't know what drilled and uncompleted wells are, they're simply the wells that have been drilled by the fracking industry before and then covered over to be used later on. And the drilled and uncompleted wells have been declining sharply as they've ramped up output. I suppose the question that I have to both of you is, where do we think the constraint, particularly re the US exporting LNG to Europe, is going to come from? I'm thinking about this particularly because, at the moment, around 40% of EU's LNG comes from the US, and that will likely rise next year because there'll be less of that kind of Russian import left within the statistics. So, yeah, what is the constraint to US supply of LNG? Is it LNG import terminal capacity within the EU, or is it the ability of the fracking industry in the US to expand and ramp up? And that goes to both of you. Maybe I'll go to Michael first and then Olena.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one I've sort of been pondering myself. Will the United States actually build all these terminals and then run out of gas? And I think in the last couple of days, President Biden's alluded to, or sort of veiled threats to the industry in terms of potential windfall taxes if they don't start investing in new drilling activity. But the industry itself has shown what it says is financial discipline. It's returned money to shareholders, it's paid down debt, and as you say, I mean, it makes sense to go for the easy wins for those wells which haven't been completed, many of which were drilled just to keep a license, and now you can go back. I mean, there are other constraints in terms of pipeline systems. Still a huge amount of methane being flared because the primary target is tight oil, and there's no gas pipeline to connect and collect that gas. I've certainly heard industry commentators from the United States, those proposing LNG terminals, of course, saying there's huge amounts of gas. There's no problem. We're not going to run out of gas. But the geological presence of a resource does not make it a reserve, and it doesn't make it commercially viable. So I think there is a concern here. I mean, I think it's probably inevitable that the United States will overbuild LNG capacity. And how long that capacity will be required remains to be seen. So I think I don't have an answer to the question, but I do think it should be a concern. I think at the same time, of course, Europe is expanding its LNG import capability very rapidly. In Germany, there's 4 or 5 floating storage and regas units being leased and installed at the moment, and plans to build others. A new one just opened up in the Netherlands. So you'll build a lot of capacity, and you'll have LNG flowing. But I guess the other issue we haven't really touched, you haven't sort of mentioned, which is part of the problem, is how long do you need that gas for? And again, listening to the industry at a conference a couple of weeks ago in London, the US industry was saying, well, ideally to finance new projects, we need you to sign up to long-term contracts. And, European companies don't want to do that because they think in the 2030s they might not need that gas.
Yeah.
So I think and that's certainly the Qatari position, is quite clear. If you want energy security, you pay for it.
Yeah.
And discussion of this so-called Asian model. So it's not just, is there enough gas? Is there enough commitment to purchase that gas to finance the continued expansion of LNG in the United States? We've seen earlier this year Henry Hub price going up to close to $10 an MMBTU, in part because of the flows of gas going into the LNG terminals. And of course, the United States has experienced a reindustrialization off the back of cheap gas. But there's a lot riding on there being a continued supply of cheap gas, and whether there's enough to continue to satisfy domestic industrial demand and a growing LNG sector remains to be seen. But of course, the reality in the power sector is you're not going to get finance to build a gas-fired power station in the United States because renewables are so much cheaper. So essentially, they've got a lot of gas. Can they get enough of it to market quickly enough to make enough money remains to be seen.
Yeah, a big question mark.
So I think there's a question mark, but I don't think at the moment it doesn't seem to be something that the industry or the government's worried about. I think the government's most concerned about the fact that drill baby drill is not really delivering.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Michael. Olena, did you want to touch upon that? Otherwise, we've got a whole bunch of questions around Ukraine as a gas transit route, and Nord Stream 1 and 2, and Ukrainian storage. So we could move on to that unless you wanted to touch upon that question first.
I just wanted to say that I totally agree with Michael. And just a few words. I think now we're just in a perfect storm. Everybody. And it is really hard to discuss how this sector will be developed for the nearest future. I think within few years, 1-2 years, we will come to some equilibrium. Yes, when the countries will understand how much they will need this gas for what period of time. The companies will understand what exactly money and from where they can get to invest, and then there might be some understanding how long contracts will be signed for the gas extraction and delivery to Europe and around. And yes, happy to move forward with other questions.
Great. Jorgen Andrews, I'm just going to give you a slight advance warning that I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question directly, but your question sits in a whole group of questions that have come in. So I'll just go over those ones first, and maybe Jorgen, you could come in at the end, unmute and ask your question. So they're mainly around clarifying the situation in regards to Nord Stream 2. Can Turkey act as a gas hub to replace Nord Stream 1 and 2? What has happened to Ukraine as a gas transit? And what motivated Russia to blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2? So those are kind of a group of questions there. Jorgen, are you able to unmute? Do we have Jorgen to unmute and ask his question?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Hi, Olena. Jorgen Andrews with the U.S. Institute for Peace. I'm also a State Department Foreign Service officer. Just wanted to ask, and apologize if you mentioned this in your presentation and I missed it, but approximately how full are Ukraine's vast underground gas storage areas right now? In other words, we know it's going to be a harsh winter, but how is Ukraine situated headed into this winter? Does it have more gas or less gas than normal winters?
Thanks.
Thank you, Jorgen. Given the nature of the questions, Olena, let's go to you first, and then I'll come to Michael.
Yes, thank you again for the question. Right now, we have around 50 billion cubic meters of gas in our storages. Usually, we would have 17-18 billion cubic meters of gas to be sure that we have a safe winter period. There might be issue if we have a really cold winter, but we also have a huge decrease in consumption. We have around 30% decrease of consumption of gas in the country. So we have sort of discussion between our government and our state company, Naftogaz, because company says that it should be, we probably will need more, some two more billion cubic meters of gas to buy, while the government thinks that 15 billion cubic meters might be enough. To sum up, again, as I said, if we have no serious damages when we have to increase consumption of gas, or if there is no really very cold winter, we will probably survive with the amount of gas we have now in our storages, because Ukraine produces gas by itself, and we just did not export our gas, we just collected it in our storages for the winter.
Thanks, Olena. Michael, if you could touch upon this briefly, just given we've got quite a lot of questions to get through.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment with any degree of expertise on the situation in Ukraine. I mean, and I would quote actually what I heard from Tatiana Mitrova on a podcast in the last 24 hours about the Turk Stream issue, in the sense of expanding the capacity of Turk Stream is not straightforward. Would take time and does rely on a lot of Western equipment. So I don't think, so you've got to go with what you've got in terms of creating a southern hub. There are also problems of connection in terms of getting that gas, through a system which is essentially designed to move Russian gas from the east to the west through, there have been connections moving gas north and south as part of European projects to create a single market. But I think it's not that straightforward to suddenly decide that we're finding that with the LNG terminals, of course, because they are not necessarily well aligned in terms of supplying Northwest Europe. So I just don't think it's very straightforward to be starting to build lots of new infrastructure. And why would you do it anyway? To make yourself reliant again on Russian gas. So I don't really, it may become part of a continued supply of Russian gas to certain countries in Southern Europe. Without mentioning names, but I don't really think that it's a viable solution. I think Europe should actually base its working assumption on they're not going to take any Russian pipeline gas in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. We're now going to switch a little bit and go back to the kind of, is it this winter, is it next winter we need to be concerned about? And I'm going to ask Frederica Rikia, I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly, to unmute and ask your question. But I suppose just as that gets set up, I think the kind of thinking here really is, okay, in the time being for this winter, we have fairly good storage across Europe, partly because it's been pumped full, partly by Russian gas, and then supplemented by others. And demand in China has been low this year. That's maybe helped ease things. But then looking forward for next year, we're going to have to fill up all of that storage again, and demand may be returning in China. So Frederica, do you want to unmute and just ask your question? I'm thinking in terms, you've posed 4 questions. I'm thinking about the one in regards to global recession.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the very interesting discussion. Yeah, I was just wondering if if we're not being too pessimistic about next winter, what's going to be the role of the recession in pushing down demand and helping us to go through next winter probably a bit more comfortably? So that's my question.
It comes off this this notion about we're reducing demand because of demand destruction. We're reducing demand because we have a recession. Politically that is not easy to handle. We already have a cost of living crisis. We have governments with budgets badly battered by the pandemic, and I don't disagree with the prospect of recession, whether it's global recession or recession in Europe as a consequence of this crisis. But no doubt it will. Recessions have the impact of damping down energy demand, and so we might solve one problem, but there'll be plenty more other problems to manage. So I would probably put it another way: how can we manage the energy crisis without having a recession, or with minimizing the possibility of a recession? And maybe that's more to do with more constructive ways of managing demand reduction than energy poverty and demand destruction, which seems to be what we're left with at the moment.
Olena, would you like to add to the answer to this question around demand, recession, what winter 2023 might look like?
That's a tough question. I will only add probably that all gas producers understand the situation now, and I think it's not only the US who is thinking how to increase gas production and probably replace Russia, because again, everybody understands that they have to produce and sell gas as fast as possible, because then there will be a green transition. So I think some European countries will also think how to develop more, how to come back to the gas development, like Groningen gas field. I think in Africa region, countries will also think about more investments and better communication, yes, with energy companies. Even in Ukraine, we are thinking how to increase gas production in the short perspective. Again, because we also believe and we also signed for the Green Deal and decarbonization issues goals. So I think this is realistic to replace Russia, maybe not in a very short-term perspective, but in a mid-term perspective, yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're now going to sort of slightly switch again. Got two questions here. The first one, I'm going to ask William George to unmute and ask his question. And then secondly, Rowley Sword to unmute and ask his question. Whilst they're doing that, these questions are basically in the group of what's been the impact on Russia of the sanctions, and what might Russia do next to seek to minimize those impacts and sell their gas and oil elsewhere. So if we could just have William first unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, and thanks very much for the talk tonight. My question is about the sanctions that the West has been pretty unified in imposing on Russia, and the impact that the reduction in Russia's market for selling its hydrocarbons has had on the Russian economy. So how damaging do we think this reduced market is for the Russian economy, and do we think this will have an effect within Russia itself? Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Before my two esteemed colleagues start answering that, can I ask Rowley to unmute and just ask your question as well, and we'll group them together, and hopefully Olena and Michael can answer both simultaneously. Go ahead, Rowley.
Sure, hopefully you can hear me okay. Michael, this follows up from one of your comments about Russia basically recognizing that Europe is not going to be one of its core markets for pipeline gas, at least in the near future, and also likely the Europeans view Russian supply through pipelines as unlikely as well. So, I mean, if Europe is no longer the market, I presume the intention for Russia is to redirect it to Asia. And given kind of current limited capacity to do so, how realistically do you think they can redirect without affecting its domestic gas output? I'm here thinking that, you know, given it's not being supplied, a lot of it's being held in quite aged gas fields. To what extent is sort of the pricing issue become a problem? How do you think it will redirect, and how competitive do you think it can be compared to sort of Qatari or Australian LNG in Asian markets?
Brilliant, thanks. I will go to Olena first, if that's okay.
Yes, sure. Actually, the sanctions already impact Russian economy and Russian energy sector particularly. I just saw that the gas production decreased, I think, up to 20%, 18% recently. So they are losing markets, but they cannot so far replace energy market with Asian market. The only thing they can do now is to decrease their production, which of course mean also for the future decrease of the profits, yes, of the money which they will receive from this business. Yes, they will try to go to the Asian market, to China and to India, but so far we see that Russia will not be able to replace so huge amount of gas which it sell to Europe.
Thank you, Olena. Michael, do you want to come in here?
Yeah. Just first on the sort of the impact on the Russian economy. Of course, one of the problems that the West has been facing is that, you know, even though volumes may have fallen, the price has been very high, and Russia has been making, you know, record levels of revenue from its exports of oil and gas. But, you know, if you look at traditionally, it's oil that's been the major source of revenue for the Russian government. Gas has been important, but not critical in LNG, even less so, partly because of the tax breaks it's been given. But so there's this. So in response to this issue, there's much discussion about trying to put a cap on oil prices, for example. But we know already that Russian oil is trading at a significant discount into India and China, and it may be in the future that Russian LNG is traded elsewhere in the world, again at a discounted price, which would be good news for those countries. We mentioned Bangladesh and Pakistan, for example. So in effect, there would be a reduction in revenue because the effective finding markets requires the offer of a healthy discount. But there's a lot of complexity around an oil price cap because Russia's response may simply, they've already said, I think, any country that place a cap won't get any oil. So we have to wait and see what happens in early December when the European Union sanctions come on crude oil. I think that's another critical juncture in terms of disruption to global energy, but I'm not an oil expert and I don't want to speculate on what's going to happen. The issue of pivoting away from Europe to Asia, I have spent a lot of time working on and spent far too much time working on places like Sakhalin. I think there is an issue around the future capability of Russia's LNG industry, which is heavily reliant on Western technologies. And I think there are issues around the continuing maintenance and production from existing terminals. The Arctic 2 LNG project, which was the next project that that Novatek was developing on Yamal together with Total, is now delayed indefinitely. Total has said, although it's not pulling out of its current investments at the moment in Novatek and Yamal, it's not making any new investments. And then there's a whole question of what happens to the Sakhalin 2 LNG project. Shell has left the project. The two Japanese companies are remaining. Speculation that Novatek might take over a large chunk together with Gazprom, but how long they'll be able to operate that terminal remains in doubt, perhaps. So I think, being able to maintain production, let alone expand LNG production, is a question mark. Pivoting away and building new pipelines to China, again, I think at the moment, China itself would look at the experience of Europe and think, whoa, we don't want to get too dependent on Russia. They have significant volumes coming from Central Asia. They now have power of Siberia ramping up to its 38 BCMs. They could expand the capacity on that, but that is using gas fields in Yakutia and in eastern Siberia, but it's not using the Yamal fields. I think building a power of Siberia 2 to Yamal, which is what Russia wants, gives an outlet for Russian gas that might have flowed either as LNG or to Europe as in a pipeline to go further south. It's a very long pipeline. The capacity is not going to be sufficient to compensate. So some of the new fields coming online in Yamal may not be developed to capacity. Others may never be developed. The gas may be left in the ground. There is an interesting analysis of this very question in the World Energy Outlook in terms of looking at the changing role of Russia in the global energy system, both in terms of oil and gas exports, as a consequence of their failure to compensate fully for the loss of a European market. And various estimates suggesting that current share of Russian international trade in gas was 30% of the global market in 2021. Under their announced pledges scenario, it could fall to 15% by 2030. And that is a reduction in income from 75 billion at 2021 prices from 75 to 25 billion. So those are significant numbers, and gas might get left in the ground. I think the other point I would make is that
just briefly, Michael, because we've only got a few minutes left.
I would say is now the other thing that the IEA did conclude was that the golden age of gas is over. Is that this has done lasting damage to the reputation of natural gas as being available, affordable, and acceptable. And so I wouldn't rush into too many new gas projects.
That's a strong and powerful statement to almost end on. I just wanted to again switch. We've only got a few minutes left here, so just brief answers if you can. But really to the sort of the title of this entire discussion in terms of the long winter and the impact that this is going to have on Europe. I think we haven't really touched on, and I feel a bit bad that we haven't touched upon it really, in terms of the impact to consumers and vulnerable households of energy prices, which is obviously going to be hard and severe. But I think the general consensus that is growing is there's enough gas in storage for this winter, it's next winter. But just in terms of picking up on something that you said in in your opening remarks, Michael, in terms of the impact of business. Dina Mufti, I think I pronounced her name correctly here, in the chat has asked one question that I'm picking up on here, which is, over the next 3 years, which business sectors in the EU will be most affected? I think there was a piece in the FT as well today about this, in terms of EU businesses start seeking to go over to the US. Maybe just a brief couple of comments from you both. Olena first, in terms of maybe from your experience in terms of Ukraine and businesses moving away from Ukraine and Europe, and the impact on business sectors, and then briefly from you as well, Michael.
Well, in our case, actually, again, we do not use Russian gas for long, since 2014, actually, when after the Revolution of Dignity, we started to import gas from Europe. Okay, there are discussions that there might be some Russian molecules, but again, we are buying gas from European companies and use gas from Europe. So in this case, and Ukraine is very, very energy intensive country. I don't know how to provide an example of Ukraine, how businesses moved from gas in Ukraine to other sources. But I can use an example of Germany, because actually Germany was heavily dependent on Russian gas, and that's, again, they suffer a lot now to decide what to do if they want to move from Russian gas, whether they have to go to another source of gas, or they have to choose just another, I don't know, go to the hydrogen or do the more energy efficiency issues. And this is usually a hard industry, which actually created a lot of Germany GDP and was the basis of German economy. So I think these businesses, they will suffer the most. They will discuss how to switch from Russian gas to other projects. And again, what I see from German discussions now, they not discuss whether they should immediately change, let's say, to the gas from Qatar, but they also discuss maybe we will already use like hydrogen, maybe we will already use some completely new ideas or new technologies to decrease gas consumption in the future. And I see this as a very promising signs for us.
Brilliant. Michael, you've almost got minus seconds, so if you could just keep this very brief.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. I'd say, one of the things we've already seen through the supply chain problems, industries like fertilizer production, where natural gas is a raw material rather than the heat source, but also those that use process heat, the ceramics, the metals industries, all of these things face challenges. But as Elena's alluded to, they also are difficult to decarbonize sectors, where we're thinking about how we're going to decarbonize them. So now is the opportunity perhaps to look where we can promote electrification where possible, and alternative sources of heat, and hydrogen may be one of them, but not blue hydrogen, because the high cost of natural gas is going to create a problem for that in the next few years. So again, keeping the industry where it is means addressing it always meant addressing decarbonization. Now there's another reason to do it.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Thank you so much for your insights, your opening remarks, and the absolutely brilliant manner in which you answered a very diverse set of questions. We didn't manage to get through everyone's questions in the chat, so I do apologize for that, but thank you all very much for your participation. There's plenty of members events coming up. There's plenty more to discuss, as there always is. Next time I would like to discuss a little bit more the energy transition and the impact of gas prices and oil prices on the energy transition, and focus a little bit more on that. That's my own personal preference. But for now, I won't take up any more of your time. It's 6:01. Have a lovely evening, and yeah, we all hope to see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.